Hello and welcome to Saturday Agenda. I'm David Speers. We're going to look back at the week in politics, and it was a week the Liberals would probably prefer to forget, with infighting and name-calling over the most difficult of issues they've faced, realistically, since their election defeat: emissions trading. It began with Malcolm Turnbull advocating on radio what he would like to see happen with the government's emissions trading scheme, opening the door to a possible negotiated compromise.
So it sounds like you're considering voting for this bill sometime either August or November if you can get some changes through.
Well, Fran, it depends on what the changes are, but there is an overwhelming consensus in the business community, and of course these are the people whose businesses have the thousands of employees' jobs which are at stake. There's an overwhelming consensus that that the law should be changed, and we should seek to advance and promote those changes.
Well, that didn't go down well with all of his colleagues, the prospect of actually reaching a deal with the government. Some of his backbenchers won't support any sort of emissions trading scheme, with or without changes. They include the Nationals, and they include a number of rural-based Liberals, including West Australian MP Wilson Tuckey, someone who's never afraid of sharing his views and his critiques quite publicly. He called his leader arrogant and out of touch.
Something has to be done about our leader in being arrogant, inexperienced in handling the biggest issue that will confront our opposition in this term of government.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull was spending a few days on his farm. He didn't publicly respond to Wilson Tuckey, but others certainly did. Here was the Shadow Treasurer Joe Hockey's take.
Every family has an uncle who goes a little wild at a family wedding. Wilson's still a member of the family, and he'll still be invited to Christmas dinner.
And all of this was just too much fun for the government.
Joe Hockey was talking about Wilson Tuckey as being like a mad uncle at a wedding, but the problem is Wilson's not alone. There's Uncle Don and Uncle Ron and Uncle Barry, and then Auntie Bronwyn, and then we've got Auntie Fran. The problem is in the coalition there are too many uncles and aunties and not enough nephews and nieces. They need some generational change.
Well, as the name-calling and toing and froing continued in the Liberal Party, Malcolm Turnbull made it back from the farm to try and pull the various threads together on this. He assembled his shadow cabinet for a hurried meeting to try and work out a sensible position. What they decided late yesterday was that they will try to amend the government scheme, despite the protestations of some in the Nationals and in the Liberals. They'll try to see if the government will agree to change the bill to offer the same protection for industry and jobs in Australia as exists under the bill being debated in the United States. That bill has passed the lower house of Congress but is still being debated in the Senate, where it's likely to undergo some changes. But Malcolm Turnbull's point is that if we have to have legislation voted on before the US works out its position, well, surely we should offer the same sort of protection as exists in the United States. The government says that there is better protection under the Australian bill than in the United States, but that, of course, is where the debate will now be. And if the opposition fails to get its amendments up, then it will vote against the government's emissions trading scheme next month in the Senate. Well, just before Malcolm Turnbull last night announced this position, I spoke to a few political pundits on all of this. Kerry-Anne Walsh from the Sun Herald, Mark Kenny from the Adelaide Advertiser, and also David Penberthy from thepunch.com.au. Been a messy week for the Liberals on this issue. Kerry-Anne, first to you, does that surprise you at all, the way this has unfolded?
No, not at all, because they've been in a mess since Brendan Nelson was the Liberal leader.
Well, it arguably cost him his job.
It arguably cost him his job, and Malcolm Turnbull has tried a number of navigating ways through this and doesn't seem to be able to appease the different competing sides within his party. And I think they would just dearly love this to be off the agenda altogether, but what they don't want at this point is a double dissolution election towards the end of this year, because they'd be absolutely slaughtered.
Because, Mark, just to go back a step, the decision at the last party room meeting was a bit of a holding pattern decision, wasn't it? There are some who think they decided to definitely vote against the scheme, others who think there's room there for a negotiated compromise with the government. It's not all that clear.
No, that's right. This is very much contested terrain, and it really is because this is a political strategy rather than a sort of a policy approach that they're taking. Malcolm Turnbull's fervent hope, I think, throughout this has been to get around the threat of a double dissolution by delaying the first rejection of the bills in the Senate, and hopefully thereby delaying the second and pushing the whole problem into next year. And the further they push it into next year, the less the chance of a double dissolution election, of course, is, because in the last 6 months it really is not a possibility at all for the Prime Minister to seek. So they're trying to sort of delay it because it is just an intractable, impossible position inside their own party.
But however long they delay it, you're still, it seems, going to have a divided party, aren't you? Even if we did wait for Copenhagen, there's no sign they'd suddenly all agree on what to do.
No, I think that's right, and I think that's what's actually changed now. I think Malcolm Turnbull has now come to the view, and I think Tony Abbott has come to the view, Joe Hockey, a number of other pragmatists have come to the view that they can't simply delay this any longer, that it is not, no amount of time is going to bring the warring sides inside the Liberal Party together on this, and that they might as well, if they're going to have an embarrassing fight, they might as well have it now. And so I think that's what we're seeing is a move to bring this on.
But what's wrong with having an embarrassing fight? I mean, this is what opposition's about. They're not supposed to be walking in lockstep on all these issues. They lost the election in November 2007. They desperately need to sort themselves out on a whole range of issues, and this is just one of them. So have a biff.
So you reckon that the best way to go is what Tony Abbott is essentially suggesting, and that is try and strike a deal sooner rather than later, get this out of the way, move back to fighting over the economy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the economy is the main game, always is, and certainly at this point it is. So, yep, nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. It's not going to go away. It's not going to go away as a problem, so they need to deal with it. And I think that's what Tony Abbott has concluded, and I think a number of others have concluded that, and it's now time to bring it on. Look, there's this talk of this thing, the velvet divorce, the split with the junior partner, the Nationals, over this, and I think that is inevitable. There's no way the Nats are going to vote for an ETS under any circumstances. So Turnbull has to steel himself for that. He also now, I think, has to steel himself for a number of recalcitrants crossing the floor. I can't see Wilson Tuckey, for example, supporting an ETS after his position this week. There'd be a number in that category, and some of them are in the Senate. So there would be difficulties to face in this regard. It'll be a bit embarrassing, but like you say, I mean, oppositions should be able to have these sorts of debates.
Absolutely.
Tony Abbott did make the point, though, I think, in his piece that oppositions tend to be a bit like debating societies, and the trouble with that is that you might not ever arrive at a final position. You just keep going around. If people have these things they harbour as deeply.
Well, that's why they have, at the end of the day, kitchen cabinets, and then leaders.
Yes.
They have to make decisions, don't they? And
That's
they have to swing the party around and all that sort of thing. This whole political obsession on both sides of politics with being not seen to be divided on anything, and the media play a part in this, that it's shock, horror, split, but in fact it's just healthy, rigorous debate over issues of great importance to the country. And I think the governments, it can be particularly bad at this sort of thing, this government, which is that they don't want to be seen in any respect to be divided over anything. We're all united, we're all doing this.
But it doesn't help when debate is a great thing and we shouldn't stifle it, but when you have a backbencher calling the leader arrogant and inexperienced as part of that debate.
It's Wilson Tuckey.
But can't you
Let's
just debate
get the bloke into perspective here.
Can't he just debate the case on its merits rather than the name calling?
Well, you tell Wilson that. You tell Wilson that.
Meanwhile, the government is, of course, loving all of this, and Kevin Rudd seemed to be happy to keep stoking the fire. He announced during the week Robert Hill as the appointment of a carbon trust, which is part of his emissions trading scheme. Robert Hill, former Environment Minister under the Howard government. And it's worth noting that a few years ago, Kevin Rudd said of Robert Hill's appointment to the UN that this would make Australia a laughing stock, that it's prostituting the diplomatic service. But take a look at his comments during the week as he rolled out Robert Hill.
Robert Hill has an extensive experience in public policy in Australia.
I started work on a potential cap and trade for Australia almost a decade ago. and the political time wasn't right then. Perhaps it's getting closer.
Robert Hill was careful, Mark Kenny, in his language about whether he supported this emissions trading scheme or not. But he did point out that he was one of the first to suggest a cap and trade scheme many years ago. This was a clever move, really, from Kevin Rudd, wasn't it?
Look, it's a clever move. Kevin Rudd's made a bit of a thing about appointing former opponents to key jobs. I think it's partly because he believes actually in the merit principle. He actually does think that, but I also think he likes to be very strongly recognised for thinking that. And these big dramatic gestures, appointing Tim Fischer to the Holy See or appointing Robert Hill, talking to Peter Costello about what future role he might play, it does make Kevin Rudd look very statesmanlike above the political fray and so forth. And so from that point of view, it's I think it fits with Kevin.
But it also carries a handy political benefit as well at the moment.
Well, it does, and the thing is, the job that Robert Hill will do, this managing this carbon trust, doesn't make sense outside of an emissions trading scheme. So he has appointed a former opponent to a key role within the emissions trading scheme that is intensely contested terrain inside the Liberal Party right at the moment.
The trust itself is quite a complex thing, but essentially it's to help develop and fund more energy efficient measures in businesses and also for households to do their bit. So yes, it is central to...
It is. It's a bit of retrofitting too, I think it has to be said, because one of the criticisms of the government's CPRS, as they call it, was that it didn't really give enough scope for individuals, the people who are really driving this whole sort of green revolution, the individual punters, to do much about reducing emissions. And so what they can do is they can buy these permits and retire them, therefore reducing the overall amount of carbon in the system. But it is retrofitting the scheme to some extent.
Kerry-Ann, do you think there is enough scrutiny being placed on the government's actual legislation? Business is still unhappy with it. We're all talking about the Liberal Party.
Business is divided on it, and so also is his cabinet. But you wouldn't
know that, would you?
No, you wouldn't know that because there's no debate outside cabinet, and certainly not in the public arena. Probably not. And there's not a great deal of public education about it either. Principally, I think, because there's the symbolism in the community of wanting to do something about global warming, but I think that they're leaving to the government the fine details of any sort of scheme. Where it's really going to come into play is when it starts affecting household prices and that sort of thing, and that's when it impacts on the electorate. But in the interim, in the electorate, the opposition is losing the argument, because within the Liberal Party there is polling that shows that climate change is still very much a matter of concern, even if a lot of people don't understand it. And the opposition, the Liberals, aren't seen to be doing anything particularly about it.
And what about the thought bubble, I guess you could call it, that popped up during the week as well on nuclear energy, and whether this, once again, should be looked at, debated properly in Australia, because we really haven't debated it seriously, as an option also in the fight against climate change. Is that going to go anywhere, Mark, or is this just a thought bubble that will die fairly quickly again?
Look, it might go somewhere in the sense that there might be the beginnings of a debate, and I think that's what we need to have in this country, is a debate. So far this has been stifled at every opportunity. It's almost official Labor Party policy not to talk about it, let alone to go anywhere near it as a policy, and that really does have to change. And the irony is that that an ETS makes nuclear more economic, as Ziggy Switkowski said this morning. He said yesterday morning, I think it was, that the carbon price actually makes nuclear more competitive. So that's one of those pieces of infrastructure. So you've got sort of cross currents here, where the people who are advocates of nuclear also happen to be opponents of an ETS, and they really need to get
Kevin Rudd did say a couple of years ago that he wanted to encourage a debate on this within Australia.
Right. Not saying that now.
Not saying that now.
That was a great debate they ran during the election. 25 nuclear reactors
in everyone's backyard. Let's bring in.
That's right. I forgot about
let's
that.
bring in David Penberthy from thepunch.com.au. David, looking at the week that was for the Liberals, how have you assessed it? Do you think Malcolm Turnbull was right to lay low for most of it on his farm?
I reckon if I was Malcolm Turnbull, I'd probably spend another couple of weeks down on the farm. It's been it's been like one of those school classrooms where the regular teacher goes away and everybody starts chucking paper planes around and throwing the dusters into the ceiling fan. You know, they've come up with more positions on the ETS than the Kama Sutra. At the same time that Tony Abbott was putting the final flourishes to his op-ed piece for this morning's Australian, saying that even if we don't think it's a particularly good policy, we should back it anyway. You had Nick Minchin thumping the table on Lateline, I believe it was, saying that it's an absolute dog of a policy and there's no way the coalition will ever support it. So I guess the only consolation for Malcolm Turnbull is that somewhere across the spectrum of options that have been presented to him by everyone from Wilson Tuckey to Minchin to Abbott, at least one of them will probably agree with him when he finally makes up his mind.
Okay. Well, what do you think would be the best way through? I mean, you mentioned Tony Abbott, he and Joe Hockey, and it's assumed Malcolm Turnbull really do prefer the idea of cutting a deal, getting this off the table and moving on sooner rather than later.
Look, I guess it's a bit of a juggling act because I take Kerry Ann's point about how there is still mainstream concern about the question of climate change, but I guess the position that people like Tuckey are coming from, and his position is actually not dissimilar from a lot of the real hard blue-collar, hard-headed sort of blue-collar view within the ALP, that we could end up taking the moral high ground on something like this, despite the inaction from most other developed nations, and certainly developing nations, and end up putting a whole stack of Australians out of work. So I don't know. I'm more worried about the latter than the former, I have to admit, and I think that's the real problem for Malcolm Turnbull here, because neither option is palatable. I guess tactically he can say, well, the government's in power, they've got the mandate, they sort of campaigned on this, let's just back it and not be obstructionist.
Kerry-Anne Walsh, Mark Kenny and David Penberthy talking to us just before last night's decision from Malcolm Turnbull that they'll seek to amend the government's emissions trading scheme to offer the same protection for industry and jobs as the US bill contains. If they don't get those amendments, then the coalition, he says, will vote against the government's bill. Stay with us after the break for more.